Welcome to the Marvelous Old World podcast. My name is Matthew Smith. Thank you for joining me on this brand new podcast adventure. We're going to dive right in here. We'll be looking at Old World America and wrestling with the question of why is it that the further back you go in our history, the more sophisticated the building stock becomes. The architecture of the Old World buildings are highly sophisticated. Many of them are architectural masterpieces, and tragically, too many of them have been disappeared either through neglect or through malicious intent, through development, through highway overpasses, through replacing these beautiful building stock with ugly corporate boxes or condo developments, buildings that are not even intended to last more than 35 or 50 years. And so as an architect and as a builder, it makes me sad to see many of these buildings gone. I'm happy that some of them still exist. We can go out and walk around and look at them. But again, we're going to look at the question of why and how is it that the further back you go, the more exquisite the architecture, the more beautiful the buildings, the more sophisticated the craftsmanship. And at a time when we were just building the infrastructure, that the technology was just sort of catching up to modernity. And how is it that with transportation systems only being recently finished, that or not even finished, how is it that these buildings show such architectural sophistication? And again, at a time where we were supposedly pioneers and covered wagons rolling across the plains and just showing up, miners, fishermen, fur trappers, millers, farmers. These are the things, the occupations that were keeping us busy at the time, and yet seemingly out of nowhere, in no time at all, you have architectural masterpieces just showing up. So we're going to be looking at this question, and thank you for joining me on this brand new podcast adventure. So I'm going to be starting with Seattle. This is Pioneer Square. I believe this picture is from around 1915, judging by Smith Tower poking up in the background, and we'll look more at that. It was the largest, tallest skyscraper of its time, west of New York City. And we have earlier automobiles in the background here. Seattle, as most cities across the country, used to have electric trolleys, and I always find it sort of amusing that they talk about sustainability now, when all you need to do is look at photos from 100, 120 years ago, 130 years ago, of our old cities, and you see electric trolley lines running everywhere, and some of them are wireless. And so there was quite a sophisticated electrical infrastructure in the earlier development of our cities as well, but they went and got rid of it, didn't they? So when they talk about sustainability, well, I feel like we had a good thing going and they mucked it up. And let's see. Let's move forward here. Now, Seattle, I'm starting with Seattle because this is my adopted city. It's a very, very strange and enigmatic place with a very bewildering history. Here we're looking at what is called the Denny regrade. Now, the city fathers decided that they didn't want to contend with the natural landscape anymore, so they just went ahead and washed it away. Now, what this photograph, what jumps out at me, other than these very strange mounds of what is not yet removed, are the houses that just sort of are sitting here very strangely, very eerily, just kind of perched in the background. And so they certainly weren't built into the earth that was being moved. They would have been up on top of the earth before the regrade projects were underway. So what that tells me is that there was an iteration of Seattle before the Seattle that we know now. There was a city before the city. And so why that is so fascinating to me, other than the sheer willpower to do all of that, is that it happened in such a short time period. Now the timeline of Seattle is going to be extremely important when we're considering this question, because until 1850 there were no we'll say European or white American settlers here. Before 1850, this was still considered to be an unknown territory, an unknown wilderness. You had the Lewis and Clark expedition before that, but it's considered to be just, not to say just, but the home of the Salish Sea Indian people. And the Salish Sea, for context, is referring to the Puget Sound. That's the Salish language, the Salish culture, the Salish Indians are a collection of different tribes all up and down and around the Puget Sound, which is, if you look at a map of the Northwest, you'll see it's a vast system of bodies of water and wrapping in and around the landscape. And so there would have been tribes all around living as they had been for 10,000 years or more. And along came, as the narrative goes, along came the white man, and now we have the cityscape as we know it today. And so again, what we're going to be looking at is the question of a lost chapter. Was there some other piece of this puzzle that is not considered when we look at our historical narrative? And it is my contention that the buildings that were supposed to have been built in this very short period of time between, let's say, 1850, when the first settlers arrived, and 1900, when you have a full-blown city, in 50 short years, there was waves of development, waves of infrastructure, and waves of building stock that needed to have been developed during that period. So let's continue. We're going to start out with the underground tour that my wife and I took, where this photo was taken of a photo on the wall underneath Seattle. So we started out here in Pioneer Square. This is the Bob Spidell Underground Tour. Bob Spidell is long since gone, but he has left behind a legacy of his own historical spelunking, and he wrote a book called The Sons of Prophets, spelled Profits, which is an elbow to the ribs of the founding fathers of Seattle, that their concerns were not so they were not as concerned with the common good, and they were concerned with making a buck, and anything that stood in their way got removed. So we went underground here, starting in Pioneer Square, right near Yesler Way. And Yesler his name will show up again and again, because it was Henry Yesler, who is credited with being part of the earliest development of Seattle with a steam-powered mill that he brought to town before there was a town back in the 1850s, and started the project of milling up the old giant old growth trees that used to dot the landscape here. So let's continue. So this is the beginning of our tour down a dark stairwell. This is our lovely tour guide. She was very unhappy that I did not want to wear the mask, but I complied in the end so that I could witness what I witnessed and not be summarily asked to leave the underground, because you know, if you know, you know. So the first thing that we were shown, this very tattered, very worn brick face. Now, as we move through this, keeping in mind what is above is city street and sidewalk. So this building here, this brick face that we are looking at, is an old storefront. Okay? This city, after those regrades, was the sidewalks and the streets were raised an entire level. So when we talk about Seattle underground, what we're talking about is not so much a series of lost tunnels that were rediscovered. It's what was left over after the city's level was raised. And so this is part of the regrade project. So what I'd like you to consider is that some parts of the city were cut down. Some parts of the city, such as the tide flats, were filled in. And some parts of the city were covered over by a new street level. And all of this, what we're talking about, all of that aspect of Seattle's development happened after 1900. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the period of Seattle later on that was before 1900, again between the periods, the dates 1850 and 1900. So this is what we were shown, a crapper, an original John crapper. Now, why am I showing this picture? Well, because it's funny, but also because they made a big stink, our tour guide did, about the very unsophisticated nature of Seattle's settlers, Seattle's founding members, in that they purchased 1,000 or so toilets by John Crapper, had them shipped out here, got a hold of them, and realized, hey, we don't even have plumbing to hook them up. And so then they decided they needed to rebuild Seattle so that they could have a plumbing system. And I kind of scratch my head. It's funny on one hand, but then I scratch my head and I say to myself, how could Seattle, the earliest Seattleites, have built the beautiful buildings that we're about to see when they didn't even know they couldn't plug in their brand new toilet? It doesn't add up to me, so let's continue on. Again, here is our lovely tour guide, and we are looking at underground Seattle. These beams spanning from stone wall to stone wall are holding up the sidewalk structures. Now, these sidewalk structures, again, are no more than 100, 110 years old. And so when you're walking around downtown Seattle, it's very likely that you're walking on top of a tunnel held up by beam structures. Now on the left, what we have are very crude stone retaining walls that are holding up the streets themselves. Now, on the right, what you have are the foundations of buildings that are said to have been built starting in 1900 or so, really 1890. And I want to dial in on these dates. Really, 1890 is the breakoff point when a lot of these new buildings were said to have been built. Why that is important is because Seattle, like Chicago, like San Francisco, like New York, like Galveston, like on and on and on, had its very own Great Fire that wiped out the business district in 1889. Now, this is a key part of Seattle's history, which, again, we will get into as we proceed, because that marks the breaking point between old Seattle and the new city that they built on top of the old. Here again, walking down these tunnels, you have the sidewalk above, you have the retaining wall, this time on the right, holding up the street, and you have what would have been old entrances. Now, a lot before they had the sidewalks built, a lot of these stone and brick formations that we'll see across from the retaining wall were actually active storefronts, or in this case, hotel entryways. Walking along, there's a lot of gates, a lot of locked gates. Now, above, what we're seeing are they're called sidewalk lights. Now, we're going to take a closer look right here. This is what a sidewalk light looks like. Now, this is lead glass. Now, I want you to look closely at these, because what these are lead glass prisms. So what they do is much like a Fresnel lens in a lighthouse. They'll throw light a greater distance than if this was just straight plate glass to shine the light through. These will actually amplify and project the light below. So above you have the sidewalk structure and the sidewalk, and then you would have had these sidewalk lights, these lead glass prisms in here, shining the light and projecting it down below, so that the tunnels themselves would have been truly illuminated in the daytime, much more than it is now. And I look at this and I wonder, how is it that all of these are broken off? And it almost seems that somebody came in here with a hammer and smashed them to bits on purpose, because perhaps they didn't want underground to be illuminated and functional any longer for some reason. Maybe they prefer to light it with light bulbs that you have to pay the electric company to operate, when this would have worked just fine. Now here's a closer up view of these sidewalk lights, and again, this free illumination. When we talk about free energy, this is what comes to mind. And this is how these sidewalk lights look from above. So you can see, most of the time people walking around don't even notice this, but this is what we're looking at. Now here's a drawing. It's sort of a crude drawing, but it paints the picture, and they had this posted in the underground tour, so I took a snapshot so we can see. Up above, we have entryways, building facades that look like this is how it's always been, but below, this would have been the original street grade right down here. And they needed to run their new plumbing sewage systems so they could hook up their Crapper John toilets. And so when we were below, what we were looking at is these retaining walls. These retaining walls, and this would have been those brick and stone storefronts, the original storefronts. And on the other side would have been the crude stone retaining walls. Okay, and this shows that at the earlier iterations of this, before the actual sidewalks were installed, such as you see over here, there would have just been ladders and crude steps coming down so that people could do their business, enter their hotel, go buy a new hat, go to a bar, what have you. And our illustrious tour guide chuckled at the fact that many a wayward drunkard fell to their demise because there weren't fences always along here, so you just had to beware. Now, this picture, a lot of these pictures that I'm showing you now are going to be of photos that were displayed in the underground tour. So I find these to be very helpful, because what this shows is a city in development, a city, again, that is has gone through multiple phases of development in a very short amount of time. This probably would have been, I'm going to go ahead and say 1920s. Now what you have is old building stock on the original grade, okay? Old buildings down here, but they're being built, some of them are being built. You can tell that they're intending on a new sidewalk meeting them at a higher level. At least that's the story that we were given. And I look at this and you know, again, thank you for joining me on this adventure, because a lot of this I'll be looking at with very fresh eyes. There's always something new to see. And so, again, the first thing that jumps out is this brand new street grade. Okay, and here's the retaining wall holding up the new street level. And you can imagine this massive infrastructure project and the willpower and the resources it would have taken to roll this out. And this is at a time before the highway system, the interstate highway system was developed in the 50s. This is before World War II. This is conceived of and launched before World War I. But you can see like the advanced thinking, and by advanced what I mean is the you know, they're thinking generationally. They're thinking about what is this city going to look like 100 years from now. They're building a brand new city in their minds, but they're building it on top of an old city. So this, what is below, would have been the old city, and they're just going ahead and rolling out the new on top of the old, because that's what you do. Now, by contrast, what we have here is a plumbing tube. This is what they were using for plumbing, allegedly, apparently, back in the old Seattle. Okay, just hollowed out log. What is this picture? This picture is this is a picture of our Seattle's illustrious madam, and it was a city of brothels and prostitutes and johns and madams. And so why am I showing this in this context? Well, because old Seattle became new Seattle by taxing the brothels. Okay, and again, this is what we were told on our tour, that the business owners didn't want to pay for the new sidewalks because they thought the government should pay for it, as the government was building the new road system. The government didn't want to pay for the new sidewalks connecting the highways that they were building to the buildings on the other side of the gap, because they figured that the business owners that were building and owning the buildings should be responsible for the pedestrians that were entering their stores. So there was a standoff, and so what we're told is that they came up with this great idea that there's so many men visiting so many prostitutes, changing so much money, that they'll just tax the brothels, and by taxing the brothels, they paid for 85% of the cost of the new sidewalk. Make of that what you will. That's the story. And so why am I showing this picture here? I have no idea why this was down here. They decided they were going to put these very strange photos of, are they clown shows? Are they actors that were famous at the time? I'm guessing. We didn't get that part of the story, but what I found very interesting is the motif of black and white. And again, if you know, you know. Shout out to Conspiracy R Us, and if you're interested in the very strange history of black and white clowning as part of the sort of more esoteric side of our founding fathers, the sort of hidden culture, the hidden history, the hidden hand behind the development of these United States, go check out the videos of Conspiracy R Us. So shout out to him. Now we're back above ground, and what do we see here? I believe this is the Pioneer Building. Now again, absolutely gorgeous, sophisticated brick and stonework. This building is said to have been built, I believe, in 1890, so this would have been right after the Great Fire that wiped out downtown Seattle. And by wiping out downtown, I mean a mile long. Something like 26 acres of buildings went up in smoke in one very tragic day. Now, here is the Smith Tower. This would have been completed in 1914, and this is what we do today, right? This is, they call this the ship or something. It's this parking garage because we ran out of good ideas. Is that it? We have old, beautiful brick buildings with pink granite columns, and then we have, in the modern era, we have this just throwaway architecture. And I hesitate to even use the term architecture. It is what it is. It's frustrating as an architect and someone who cares a great deal about the built environment. It's frustrating to see this, and I know I'm not the only one. Now, here's what our pioneers were doing. Somehow they had the ability and the time and the know-how and the tools to go ahead and carve such sophisticated stonework. And when I look closely at this, perhaps this is sandstone, and perhaps it doesn't last forever. But when I look closely at this detail, I have to ask myself, is this 100 years old or 120 years old? Is that it? Or is this older? And I'm just asking the questions. Was one column not sufficient here? Did you have to carve a grid in relief of a grid of 4? it's exquisite, and it's humbling. As somebody who, again, I've built a lot of buildings, but what this speaks of to me, this speaks of the type of craftsmanship that you would associate with artisan guilds, with generational skills that were passed down from grandfather to father to son to grandson over multiple generations. Here you have the Green Man carved. You have all sorts of symbology that shows up. Every aspect of this was thought of, was well thought. And what truly astounds me is that if you look at the buildings associated with or attributed to, let's say, Louis Sullivan, the Chicago architect that was Frank Lloyd Wright's first employer, when you look at those buildings, you see this level of sophistication, ornamentation from the guy who supposedly, form follows function. But then you look at it, and it's just the exquisite nature of the ornamentation on Louis Sullivan buildings. It reminds me of this, and I've never seen an accounting of it. It's just sort of there, and it's just so beautiful that we just can't even see it. Sometimes is how I feel. And I have a book on historic Denver, Colorado, and it's the same thing. It's almost exactly the same thing. Some of these buildings almost look identical, and the ornamentation almost looks identical. So I don't know. We'll continue our exploration, and we'll see how we do. And again, what I'm thinking of is perhaps breaking this up into two podcasts, where this one would be dedicated to this underground tour, and here we are above ground, where we're just below this area, looking at the foundations of these buildings and the underside of the sidewalk. And then we'll do another deep dive into the Seattle timeline and show you the broader picture, zoom out a little bit. And again, this is a balcony. This is a stone balcony. And when I look at this, I feel like I'm seeing ruins. These sort of rivets here would be a structure added in our time to hold this up, because it's in such a fragile state. And Seattle suffered an earthquake back in the 80s, I believe it was. So a lot of, they have to be concerned with earthquake proofing. So you'll see in Seattle's old buildings and new, of course, there's a lot of X-bracing and steel beam X-braces that are retrofitted into this old building stock. But I mean, a carved stone balcony with stone faces that look like they've been worn away by epochs of time. And again, yes, sandstone doesn't last forever, but I do feel like what I'm looking at are almost ancient. And I know that might be a stretch. I'm aware of that. Again, I believe this building is said to have dated from 1890. That's only 130 years ago. Is this level of erosion, can this be explained away by 130 years? I don't know. Perhaps, but I'm open to other explanations as well. I'm humbled and I'm awed when I see this type of stonework. And again, this is a period where, there were settlers just showing up. They were coming for the gold rush in the 1897 Klondike Gold Rush. They would have been interested in mining, in trapping, fishing, farming. The builders would have been probably mostly carpenters, millers, loggers. Most of the material that we would have had at hand would have been wood, old growth, Douglas firs, old growth cedars, wood that you could build buildings to last many lifetimes. But here we have stone and brick of the most sophisticated nature. So that's what we'll be looking into. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to close this first chapter. And again, this is a brand new podcast. I'm new to this format. I really thank you for joining me on this new adventure that I'm taking. I'm excited, and we'll be getting more into all of these questions and taking deeper dives as we move forward. Till next time, this is the Old World Podcast, the marvelous Old World Podcast.